Okay, so let's go with the next session on molecular communications, modeling languages, and simulators. I am Luca Flicetti, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Perugia in Italy. My talk is on simulation of nanoscale communications on cyberphysical systems. In this work, we have analyzed the congestion phenomena on a receiver node in a nanoscale molecular communication system. And we have proposed a simple congestion detection scheme and 4 different rate control algorithms in order to reduce the transmission rate at the transmitter node. The performance of the rate control algorithms has been evaluated by the BEANS2 simulation framework that has been presented in the first day of this workshop. Here we have analyzed the congestion phenomena on a molecular communication system, more in details. We have analyzed a drug delivery scenario. Here the scope is that the target site has to absorb only a predefined amount of drugs, and the target site could be a damaged tissue or a tumoral site, and so on. This scenario is composed by 2 nanomachines. The first one here in green is the actuator nanomachine that may carry on its internal stores a lot of drugs. And the second nanomachine is a controller node, here in red, that is able to detect the target site, and it is able to trigger the release of drugs from the actuator nanomachine by the release of a start signal. After the reception of the start signal, the actuator nanomachine will release the drugs in the communication channel. But the communication distance between the transmitter node and the target site is unknown, so the release of drugs will increase after each emission. For this reason, the controller node will monitor the drug absorption on the target site by absorbing a small part of the drug molecules by its own surface receptors. And it may decide to transmit a control signal in order to reduce the release rate at the actuator nanomachine. And it may also decide to transmit a stop signal in order to stop the release of drugs. The control signals are encoded by different patterns of bursts of molecules by the on-off-King modulation with a single duration Ts. And the Huffman encoding ensures that the most frequent message, the control message in this case, has the lowest amount of bits associated. The first bit of each message is a synchronization bit. Okay, let's see now more in details the transmitter node. This node is a very simple node, and it is not able to estimate the distance from the target site. And for this reason, it is not able to estimate the optimal emission rate. This means that the transmitter node starts probing the network by increasing the emission rate by a fixed quantity. This means that after a lot of time, the total amount of released molecules will increase quadratically in the environment. So the target site and also the controller nanomachine will react only at the limited rates because their surface receptors are busy with the previous simulations. So it is necessary to reduce the transmission rate in order to reduce the loss rate. Here are summarized the main points for the congestion detection. As I have just said, the total amount of released molecules will increase quadratically. So we could expect that also the total amount of received molecules will follow a quadratic law. But the receiver node is not able to absorb a huge amount of molecules because it has a finite number of surface receptors, and each receptor requires a finite time to complete the absorption. This time is known as trafficking time. Moreover, a diffusion-based molecular communication system is very sensitive to the issue of congestion, cause of the high latency of the communication path. For this reason, it is necessary to implement an early detection of the congestion conditions in order to avoid an heavy overload at the receiver side, and also to avoid the waste of molecules of both drugs and signaling molecules. This is very important because these molecules could be expensive, limited in number, and may cause undesired side effect on the body of the patient. So we have proposed a simple congestion detection scheme that estimate at runtime the assimilation profile at the receiver side. We want to detect a significant decrease with respect to the expected value. And when the controller on the machine detects that there is a significant decrease, it may decide to transmit a control message. And in the same way, it may decide to transmit a stop message when the total amount of desired drugs has been absorbed by the target site. Here I proposed 4 different rate control algorithms. And on these graphs are shown the burst size over the time. And the first algorithm is the restart. Here we have taken inspiration from the slow start phase of the well-known TCP Tower protocol. And as we can see here, after the reception of the control signal, the burst size has been set to the initial value. A variation of this algorithm is the restart double. And here, after the reception of the control signal, the transmission time has been doubled than before. Note also that the observation time at the receiver side has been doubled than before in order to correctly estimate the assimilation profile. The third algorithm is called halve, and here we have taken inspiration from the fast recovery phase of the well-known TCP Rhino protocol. And here, after the reception of the control signal, the burst size has been set to the half than the previous value. A variation of this algorithm is the half double, and again, the transmission time has been doubled than before. The performance of these algorithms have been evaluated by a simulation campaign performed by the BEANS2 simulation framework. On these graphs are shown the assimilation rate in black and the rejection rate in red. And as we can see here, for the halve algorithm, we have the highest amount of emission of control messages, here depicted by the red arrows. And we can see also that the values associated to each peak is always increasing. On the bottom left, we have the restart algorithm, and here we can see that for this algorithm has been transmitted a single control message. And for both the double schemes, we can see that the peak associated to each, the values associated to each peak are always decreasing, but at the price of a longer transmission time. Here are shown the cumulative ratios between the rejection rate and the assimilation rate for the 4 rate control algorithms. As we can see here, for the halve algorithm, the cumulative ratio is always increasing. This means that this algorithm is not able to completely decongest the communication, the controller node. This means that the controller node works always on the edge of congestion. Whereas for the restart algorithm, the cumulative ratio is nearly constant, and for both the double schemes, the cumulative ratio is always decreasing, but again, at the price of a longer transmission time. Here are shown a number of performance metrics. The first one is the normalized efficiency, defined as the ratio between the target assimilation value and the total amount of assimilations that the receiver node should be able to perform in absence of the congestion condition. As we can see here, the highest efficiency are associated to the double schemes. And as we can see on the top right graph, we have a dual metric of the normalized efficiency, that is the total emitted carriers. And we can see here that for the halve algorithm, we have the highest amount of wasted molecules. On the bottom left, we have the throughput. And as we could expect, both the half algorithm and the restart algorithm reach the highest throughput value. And the dual metric of the throughput is the delivery time, shown here. And as we could expect, the double schemes requires the higher delivery time. And we can conclude that if all of the performance metrics are equally important, the best trade-off could be the restart algorithm, because it exhibits good values in all metrics. And more in details, it reaches the highest throughput. So, in this work, we have analyzed a drug delivery scenario. More in details, we have analyzed the congestion phenomena on the receiver node. And we have proposed a simple algorithm for the early detection of congestion events that could be easily implemented on devices with limited resources, such as the nanomachines. And to conclude, we have compared the performances of the rate algorithms, and we may conclude that the best trade-off is the restart one. An ongoing and future work could include the extension of the congestion control strategy in a multi-access environment composed by multiple transmitter and receiver nodes, whose commands may interfere each other. And it is also interesting to analyze moving nanomachines, and it is also useful to control the transmission rate by a convenient switching from 2 or more control algorithms in order to maintain the high throughput. So, thank you very much for your time, and are there any questions?
Okay, sorry, I don't mind when I ask my question. So maybe a general question, because you've again mentioned the SPINS2 simulator. So I know of Accord for molecular communication. How does this compare, or are you aware of this work?
No, we don't have compared the results of the simulations with the Accord. And maybe it should be useful to consider also other kind of simulators, but we think that BINS2 is more suitable for the design of a communication protocol like this.
Okay, and then a bit more technical question. In the beginning, you had some equation, I think, for the observed number of molecules, and it was some integral over time. So can you explain what this was?
Yeah. We have taken decision on the total amount of absorbed molecules, because we think that it is more easy to take decision on this value, whereas on the rate, because it is more noisy. Okay.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
So your different schemes where you have the halving and increase again in TCP, people have optimized, yes, or maybe the previous slide again, where you can sort of see your input right, back one more maybe. So these different schemes in TCP, some people have optimized the halving and the increase rate. So they treat the two of them as parameters. They usually call them alpha is the slope of the increase rate, and beta is the fraction by which you decrease each time. And they've been able to do things like better target the buffer size for traditional TCP. But is there optimization that you could do here by adjusting this, sort of treating them as a continuous parameter and trying to optimize some of the later outputs from your system?
We have transmitted, we have considered only these simple rate control strategies, but this is an ongoing work. So we hope to be able to combine different type of rate control strategies under the same drug delivery scenario.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so let's go with the next speaker. The next talk is held by Helena Blukaina, and she's a lecturer and assistant professor at the School of Electrical and Electronic Engineering of the University of Dublin. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. So you can see the title of my talk is Challenges in the Design of Micro-Scale Electronic Systems, or sometimes we just say micro-electronic systems. So I'm from University College Dublin, but like I would like to acknowledge an input from my colleagues, in particular from University of Sorbonne and also from UPC Barcelona. So in a way, I'm actually representing a different community here because my background is electronic engineering. And for this reason, I would like to give something like an overview. Sorry?
For the streaming, I'll just give you this.
Right, okay.
Sorry, just lift up your hair. Just lift it up.
Okay.
Sorry.
Right. Sorry, just 1 second. Electronics, nanoelectronics, in particular analog integrated circuit design and circuit theory. So I know it may be a little bit far away from maybe what is discussed here, but the idea is that I would like to explain you what kind of challenges we have and what kind of knowledge we summarize when we design the systems. Also, I have a couple of points here for discussion. For example, I would like to show you that actually microelectronic systems, they are incredibly complex. And I'm quite sure that the challenges we see in the design of microelectronics, they will be very similar to what you actually simulate and kind of what you're trying to study in molecular communications. So I will try first to explain why we say that microelectronics is very complex. What is basically the origin of that complexity? So when I say it's complex, what do I mean by this? So how do we go then from understanding and modeling to design, and then in the end, what challenges and existing solutions are there? So how we can use the existing solutions, and maybe how we can invent new methods for our systems. So just a little bit of history, very, very brief history here. So if maybe something you know, 95% of semiconductor products right now, they have a form of integrated circuits. So which means that if you look at integrated circuits, you'll find it a small chip. Usually the area is around 1 square centimeter. And basically all kind of consumer electronics like laptops, iPhones, and so on, they're basically based on integrated circuits. So back there, like 1965, Gordon Moore, one of the researchers who studied semiconductors, observed quite interesting phenomenon. So he saw that every year, so we see about a double of density of components on an integrated chip. Which means that if you look at the area of a chip, with every year we have more and more transistors which are the core of integrated circuits. And then starting from that year, we plot then the number of transistors per one die or per one chip, and we see that in a log scale it follows this linear law. So for us it means that if like 30 or 40 years ago we would see thousands of transistors in one integrated circuit, now we actually fabricate billions, 10 billions or even 50 billion transistors per one die. So we are definitely speaking about complexity in particular in terms of numbers here. So, but the critical question is how long this trend is going to continue, because we kind of understand that we cannot scale down transistors. We are reaching already atomic levels. So still we believe that at least next 10 years we are going to scale the number of transistors, and we are going to see smaller circuits with really good, really improved functionality. Just as an illustration what kind of law we are speaking here, so if you look at the historical first microprocessor, it's 1970, so this first microprocessor had 4,000 transistors. Now 15, 17 years ago, we would have like an Intel Pentium transistor. So you can see it has 42 millions of transistors. And this was like literally the size of a fingernail. Now, 7 years ago, it's not even very updated it's not very updated example, but Intel processor now would have actually from 2 billions to 50 billions of transistors. Moreover, speaking about these trends, there are two trends we can identify, and we call them now more than more. So first of all, definitely there are plans to so-called aggressive CMOS scaling, which means that we are going to decrease the size of transistors, we are going to fabricate nanoscale devices, and there are going to be hundreds of millions of them per one die. On the other hand, another very important trend here is that we also integrate non-electronic components with those transistors. So these called heterogeneous components, and we mean that in one chip with transistors, we can actually have nano devices, micro devices, optics, RF, power, sensors, and so on, and it's all going to be in one small chip. So thinking about then again the complexity of these microscale systems, this is something like a chip. So this is a photo of a chip, and on top of that you can see a map of Europe. So it's a huge size from the point of view of how many components are there. We can compare a chip with a map of a Europe or of a world. So you can see that there are different blocks. We can compare it with cities or towns or villages, and then there are those communication channels, which can be seen as links between those blocks on the chip and so on. So it's an incredibly complex interconnected system. So moreover, again, remember, now it has not only transistors, but there may be other components, which are nanomechanics, optics, and so on. So those are non-electrical components, and it's more difficult to integrate them with electronic components. And we are speaking about functional and structural complexity. What we would like to do, we would like to achieve more and more functions. Moreover, we want to achieve them fast, so we want to get some very fast functions performed on the chip. And at the same time, the question is, so how we are going to design them? So what we are going to do with the design? So the current design flow is actually as follows. It's a very high representation of the design flow. So we start always with system level representation, which is the highest possible level in this case. There are actually quite many tasks associated with this level representation. First of all, we must extract parameters, we must characterize non-electronic systems, we must think about simulations method, then design methods, then specifications and so on, and then we end up with a behavioral model for non-circuit components. So there's quite many tasks there, and we fit them into a system level representation. And then based on design methods, we can proceed to so-called top-down approach. Top-down approach is something purely electronic. So then from top-down approach, we go back and then we go and then we design the system to a transistor level. And then we get the result. So top-down approach is itself a very complex procedure, because we start with function level, then we split those function level into smaller blocks, and then we look at the simpler blocks, and then again we look at the logic blocks, and then eventually we go to a physical level or a transistor level. So our idea here, our point here is that this is a system, so it's a kind of consequence of actions, so we follow those steps, and in the end we will arrive to kind of a model or representation of the system, and design steps at each level, they are independent. So if I represent a system using functional blocks, it actually will be independent of physical level simulations or transistor design. But taking into account the complexity, taking into account how many transistors we have, taking into account that we also want to add non-electronic functionality, like MEMS, like optics and so on. So there is a big problem right now, in particular in this kind of section here. So a top-down approach is also difficult, but we also have a lot of problems here. So at this level, so what to do, how we synthesize analytical methods, simulations method, how we actually extract parameters, it's actually now more and more difficult, and there are no standard tools. Unfortunately, there are just no standard tools there. So in particular, I would like to say that although it may look like simulations, not something very serious, something we shouldn't take very serious, it's actually very important, in particular for electronic design, simply because we cannot introduce any changes to the system when we send it into fabrication. So if you want to create a system with some complex functionality, our only choice, the only choice is to make a model of a system, be happy with simulations, and then send it for design. After we actually send it for procession, there is no changes there, and the systems are very expensive. So it may not be the case for our usual kind of everyday electronics, but it's actually the case for, in particular, for nanoscale kind of novel systems and so on. So everything must be validated before we send this system to fabrication. Now, saying this is a kind of Having said this, that we are dealing with complex systems, many components are kind of functionality and so on. So let's see actually at one of the examples. There could be many examples here, but one of the examples I choose for this presentation is the communication on a chip. So if you look again at just a very typical chip, even though it may have a lot of components, like non-electronic components, still there will be quite a lot based on transistors and based on digital signals. So for a large chip, which includes many sub-blocks, what we would like to have is the same clocking signal delivered to every sub-part of the chip. So clocking signal is a signal of this form. So there is this sequence of events. It's basically this square duty cycle as shown here. So which can be approximated as a sequence of clocking events, and this sequence must be given at a very particular frequency. So because all transistors, kind of all electronic circuits, all components must work on the same clock frequency, you have to ensure that one part of the chip here and then another part of the chip there, they receive the same clocking signal. So you just have to create a system that will deliver the same clocking signal everywhere to any part of the chip. So what we usually have for a chip, there is a physical oscillator. So there is like a quartz oscillator. So this quartz oscillator, provides quite stable signal. So somewhere here, for example, we will have this master oscillator, and our task then will be to copy this signal and deliver this signal everywhere to every component on this chip. So this is the task. Now, how it's done? There are quite many options here. So, but usually it's done by using a system which is known as phase lock loop oscillator, or just a phase lock loop, or just PLL. We don't really use directly the oscillation signal from this master oscillator, from this physical oscillator. We would usually feed this signal first to subsystem, this electronic subsystem as shown here, and then this subsystem will create a copy and then transmit this copy somewhere else. So if you look at this, again, it's a very high representation of the system, phase lock loop. So you will find that, first of all, what this subsystem does, it compares the input master signal, then it takes the difference between the internal signal in this loop with the master signal, so it provides a different signal there. Then it uses some elements of control theory. If you remember, there is proportional kind of path here, then integral path here, so it uses this control theory, and then it gives a control signal. Control signal then goes to a digitally controlled oscillator, it's another kind of component here, and then digitally controlled oscillator provides a kind of a copied signal. So the copied signal is compared to the reference signal, and if there is a big difference, then this control path here, KPKI, so the one you see here, will correct the code for this DCO oscillator, and the PLL will change the frequency closer to the reference signal. So how it works, you can see here, this is our reference signal, that's the signal we want to create a copy. Then this is the signal we get from a digitally controlled oscillator. So then the signals are compared, and if the frequencies are closer, so nothing happens, DCO provides the same frequency. If there is a difference between the reference signal and the DCO, then the system with feedback loop will adjust DCO oscillations. So if you want to see kind of how it happens, here's an example. So we start with some other frequencies in this DCO, and we provide the reference frequency, which is at this level here. So this is the level of the frequency. And with time, because the DCO doesn't provide the right frequency, with time the signal is adjusted, and you see how it converges to the reference frequency. So this is kind of the basic idea. And if you ask me why we don't use the master kind of oscillation, the oscillations from a physical oscillator to a chip, it's just because it's not really stable oscillator. So if something changes, like a frequency, like a temperature or kind of voltage, it actually might provide a slightly different frequency. But this system has a feedback loop control, and like it's actually capable of fixing this frequency and staying on the desired frequency. Now, the problem is just one subsystem. So if you want to distribute the same reference signal everywhere in the chip, you actually have to create a network of these PLLs. So when we will say we have a network of many oscillators, like shown here, so each node is actually a PLL. So PLL communicates with neighbors. PLL actually receives the reference signal. So only one of these PLLs, only let's say in our case PLL number 2 will obtain the signal we would like to copy, so we would like to create a replica. And then all other PLLs will be synchronized locally with its neighbors. And then if you need like provide a clocking signal for this component of the chip, it will be taken from, let's say, PLL5. If you need a clocking signal in this part of the chip, you will take it from PLL number 15. So the idea is we drive only one oscillator with reference signal, and then all other oscillators must synchronize and must give you the same reference signal. So what are the complexity, what are the problems here? First of all, if you look at this PLL, you will see there are quite many blocks there. So they are in general digital, they are in general nonlinear, and it's kind of a problem to analyze just only one PLL. And in this case, we are speaking that we must connect them into a network. There are quite many tasks there, advanced functionality, too many block elements kind of. So we have to connect them in the network. We have to ensure that the network synchronizes. So there are a lot of kind of problems associated with particular digital design. So which I'll just list them, but I don't mention them. So the question is what to do. So what we can do. What would we do in this case? Well, first of all, we can use numerical simulations. That's the obvious kind of fun. So why don't we just simulate the system? So we can say that we stay within system level, so we don't use transistor level simulations. We just take each particular block and try to analyze them at a very high structural level. So structural modeling or behavioral modeling, you can use software like MATLAB Simulink, for example, one very commonly used software. So what do we do in this case? We will just take the logical blocks. We will assign some functions and we will try to connect them properly with different signal lines. So this is just a screenshot from a Simulink, just one PLL example. Simulink and kind of structural modeling is nice because you don't need to understand the system at a deeper level, but you must be able to explain what's the logic behind each block. And if you're able to connect logic blocks with right signals, you in principle will get a very good approximation. So we are building this Simulink model and we try to simulate it, and we find that if we want to simulate one PLL, it will take maybe 2 minutes to get one transient. If we want to simulate a network, which is 2 by 2 PLLs, it will take them 8 minutes. And if we try to simulate a network 10 by 10 PLLs, kind of never, because it takes so long time, the actual processing time scales non-linearly with the number of PLLs and so on. And if you can imagine, if you have like a large system and you would like to have 100 by 100 PLLs, you probably will never actually get one transient simulation. So we conclude that the problem on the good side, it gives us a very good idea how in principle one block can work. We can verify it against transistor level simulations, so it's deeper physical level simulations. The problem is extremely long, so we will not be able to simulate like a network of these systems. It provides no insight, it provides a lot of other associated problems and so on. So good to try some components, but it's never good to understand what's actually the network behavior or how to design it. So then the solution would be apply some mathematical modeling. By saying mathematical model, I mean that we can try to provide an explicit mathematical expression. So if you compare again, if you look back and compare this block diagram here, there is no explicit mathematical expressions at all. You just say here is a logic, it's a comparator, it's a kind of electronic component, and so on. What you can try to do now, you can try to apply some mathematics. If you look at the system and you will try to write down all equations, which is actually quite a challenging task, for one node you will end up with 8 equations, which are nonlinear, piecewise, stochastic, and so on and so on. So in principle it's not bad, they look maybe complex, but in principle now you can solve it. So this is just only one node, I will remind this is just one node. So we have those piecewise, nonlinear, stochastic equations. We model just this particular system and we can try to simulate them in a network. Now in a network, we will take that block and we will then create a graph. So we will use some elements of graph theory in this case. We say that we have vertices and edges. We will create the structure of the graph. We will then build up an adjacency matrix. And then all algorithms in the software, like you can write a C code or you can write like a Simulink code, then you will build some algorithms based on the adjacency matrix. So again, it will require a little bit of work here, but in principle, this is going to be very fast. So I'll just show you some examples. This is actual signal. This is experiment on a 65 nanometer chip. So you can see that if we give this reference signal, PLL is going to synchronize the reference signal. It starts providing this copy of the signal, so it takes some time. But also this mathematical model, kind of, you can see this goes here, this is a mathematical model. So it actually gives you a very good idea of how actual real electronic component behave. So you can add some noise, you can add some jitter and so on. So on a good side, the mathematical approach is so fast, so you can actually get some design rules. So you can explore design space. For example, if you have some parameters you want to change, like control parameters in the feedback loop, you can actually explore this design space, in this case it's design plane, and you can say that if you want to get a very good synchronization, we should operate the system somewhere in this range, which is shown by the blue color here. So mathematical modeling is very fast and very accurate. It will require some work because you will have to derive equations, but in principle it's not impossible. We can then explore design space. We can then say designers that you should take this particular gain here, this particular kind of comparator there. So it always results in some design rule, and it's kind of very useful. But there is one problem though, because numerical simulations, just taking those equations and iterating those equations, does not provide any understanding of the system. So it doesn't tell us why the system synchronizes. We can only observe this, but we cannot explain it. So the problem we are right now is, so we need some new paradigms and we need some new methods and some new understanding. So we just cannot proceed with standard kind of design approaches, standard modeling approaches, because it doesn't result in understanding. And if we cannot understand, we cannot create new systems. So for this reason, we actually have this idea. I don't think it's a very common idea. As a matter of fact, I think it's a quite new paradigm for electronic systems. So we're using statistical approaches for communications on a PLL. Starting from this stage, we don't see it as an electronic system, but we see it as just some oscillator which communicates with other oscillators, and we have this phase difference, so we just want to synchronize them. Although each block here, or in a system in general, is deterministic, we are going to see the system as a statistical system. When I say statistical, which means I can obtain their statistical properties, like the average of variance, applying the operation which is known like Frobenius-Perron operator. So again, it's very interesting because the system itself, in principle, is deterministic. So you know the function, if you know this input, you will get the output. On the other hand, you can kind of see it as a probabilistic system. So you can actually obtain probability density function if you apply this procedure here. So there is a procedure. Again, it's not maybe particularly difficult or particularly simple, but you can do it. So, which means that if you analyze each block here, you can get probability density functions for all blocks in this diagram. And then you can guess that if you have some probability for one node, you can combine them and get probability for a network. So just an example how it works, if you have a deterministic function like the process shown here, so the conditional probability will be then found using this formula. You plug in this in the integral equation, you solve the equation, and you get the probability density function. So I'll show you the result. If you recall those 8 piecewise nonlinear stochastic equations for one node, now they are reduced to 3 equations, and if you look at these equations, they are linear. So we have some control parameters here, but more interesting, we can solve these equations. Analytically. So moreover, we can simplify this problem, and now we are speaking about analytical solutions. So just to show you some results, if you remember the plane from numerical simulations, that's the one we got from numerical simulations, and that's the one we got from statistical approach. In this case, you can see the plane is the same. So we are looking again at some error, some difference between the reference signal and the intrinsic kind of signal provided by DCO, and we see that actually we can get analytical solutions for this case, and we say that the system is stable here. So the idea is we can actually then apply some, get some understanding and apply some analytical solutions. Just this work is currently in progress, so we have obtained some results, and it seems like they're quite promising. So on the good side, we see that it's interesting. I mean, like, it's just an interesting idea. Seeing deterministic systems as something with, systems having probability kind of statistical properties. And when we start with a lot, kind of many nonlinear equations, in the end we reduce them and we can get like only few linear equations, and we can, in terms of average quantities. So we're able to predict a lot of properties of the system. So we can incorporate noise. We can connect more systems like this, and it seems is going to be quite okay to do. The problem it requires the complete kind of steps, which leads to this kind of simplified equations, requires some advanced skills, and they are in principle difficult to derive. But it seems like it's going to work. It's going to work much faster, and it will provide us some real insight how these communicating systems, how these kind of networks are going to work. Just some conclusions and discussions. I just want to say that still, because we are speaking about so many transistors and so many components in a chip, it's actually really difficult. So when someone designs a chip, it's usually teamwork, not just one person, but most probably like hundreds of engineers working on just one chip. So design flows, you saw the steps for the design flows, just quite many challenges there, because you need simulations tools, you need fast simulations tools, you need new design methods, and so on. And actually now we say that engineering and modeling, in particular in electronic design, is an art. So there are no kind of standard approach you can apply, it's really an art. So the problem is it's difficult to master only for one person, and like software packages changes a lot, and again, still, I would say it's more challenges than answer at this stage. On the other hand, it seems like it's a good time when we can adopt different methods from different sciences. So we can use mathematics, we can use statistics. So it seems like it's working in this huge and interesting area where we can transfer all these mathematical skills. So again, no universal modeling and design approaches exist, but again, there is a space to invent new approaches and invent new kind of techniques here. And I think for research, it's a really interesting, nice area. So thank you, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Elena. So any questions for Elena?
Thank you, Elena. Thank you very much. So indeed, there are many interesting analogies and insights between designing complex silicon chips and the challenges we're facing in molecular communication networks. So my question is, I understand that in that model-based design space exploration you show, whether it's based on numerical simulations or with stochastic analytical modeling, you go from circuit level parameters up to system level performance metrics. Yeah, if I understood
yes,
well. Yeah.
yeah.
My question is, but the complex system is much more vertical. Can you extend that, or is it possible to go down into device level aspects or even technology, or go higher up into system-wide attributes of complexity like resiliency or robustness, or etc.? So how wide vertically can you extend this approach?
This approach will have to stay within few levels of very high system level representation. You can use in principle some software like Cadence, VHDL, kind of spice core simulations. You can in principle simulate it numerically up to transistor level or physical level, but again, it just takes a lot of time. But this kind of statistical approach will have to stay within only few levels of a high-level system representation. Yes, we are able to relate it to some circuit parameters like the gain of those loops and kind of some other circuit parameters, but unfortunately, it cannot just go very deep down to a physical level.
And going up?
Going up like you mean like what, like environmental parameters or?
No, like describing qualitative attributes of the system, like resiliency,
yes,
complexity, adaptability, etc.
Yeah, so now basically the task is to extend it up to a system and see how we can translate it to a very high level system here.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Other questions? No one? Okay, thank you again, Elena. The next talk is held by Tuna Turku. He's a professor from the Montefici Technica.
Hello, everyone. This is Tuna Tuğcu from Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. In today's talk, I'll just, rather than going on what molecular communications is or talking about our research on molecular communications, I'll be talking about and a little bit doing the advertisement for our ongoing work as for the GPU-based simulator for molecular communications. This is, as I mentioned, it's an ongoing work. It's in the early phases at the moment. This is the agenda for my talk. So our aim is actually to come up with a customizable simulation tool for molecular communications. The basic motivation we had for this study was that we've been doing different types of research in molecular communications in our group. In almost all of our papers, we have to redesign our simulator from scratch. Sometimes we reuse previous work, but mostly it is a redesign. And the more important thing actually is, if you look at the work in literature on molecular communications, we're actually mostly doing a similar thing. We have zillions of molecules that actually each molecule is doing a very simple task. They're just moving according to diffusion. Of course, there are different types of diffusions. You may have flow or with or without flow in others. But the more important thing is it is zillions of items doing the same type of research. This actually directly implies the use of GPU. Up to now, what we did was actually doing CPU-based simulations in our group, and it was taking bloody ages to complete. That implies that we have to make some simplifications. We have to tweak the parameters so that we finish our simulations in time. And when you do that, actually, you fall into a very basic mistake that, especially if you take your step sizes longer so that the simulations end earlier, it's possible that you're just jumping over the receiver. A molecule that should have been received will not be received. To avoid this, you have to make your steps smaller, but then the simulations are getting extremely longer. So there's a trade-off there. So that's why we're actually pushing for the use of GPUs. Therefore, we're using GPU for parallel processing. It's an open source project for the use of the whole society. It's available at the end. I will share the link. It's available over GitHub. We would appreciate if you also use it, and if you use it, if you come up with your own models in it, if you also share your contributions, that would also be appreciated. So we want to encourage the Nano Networking Society to make use of it. So the motivations are, as I briefly mentioned, we need to redesign the simulator for almost every new work. One other problem is the reproducibility of our results. If you do something better than what I did in my papers, you're welcome to, of course, compare with ours, but it would be best if we all use a similar simulator so that the comparison actually makes sense. That's why actually we're designing it as a platform, as a flexible platform, so that everyone can go with the same platform and the results are comparable. So it will also hopefully serve as a benchmark. And as I mentioned, the large number of molecules is our primary motivation for deciding to use GPUs. So GPU accelerated computing is the use of actually a graphics processing unit together with the CPU, but actually the CPU just works as a coordinator for the overall system. I will soon be discussing about the computer we're using. You will realize that it's a really very simple computer. We're not depending on the power of the CPU. That's our aim, actually. GPUs make use of highly parallel architecture with thousands of processing cores. And on the other hand, CPUs typically work on a few cores if you're able to use those cores. Most of the times, actually, you're using only one of the core if you don't do parallel processing there. So we said the structure of molecular communications simulation actually implies the use of several, actually, thousands of cores. Every molecule is doing those simple actions, which could be easily implemented and executed by those cores. And the nature of the problem, therefore, implies the use of a parallel GPU system. And we're able to achieve tens of performance gain with a factor of 10 times, several tens of times, compared to traditional CPU programming. For the workflow of our design, what you do is you generate your simulation environment with Lua scripts, and then you run your simulations and collect the results in that environment. It's simple. The environment is generated by making use of the config generate Lua script. The parameters, you provide your parameters for your simulation, and you define your transmitter or transmitters, similarly your receiver or receivers. You define the parameters for your simulation environment, your diffusion coefficient, whatever. And then it will generate a separate file. And this file is then used as the input for your simulation. The parameters you need to define are the number of transmitters and the number of receivers. Actually, the transmitter we have is just a transmitter point. It's a point source, not a spherical or other type of transmitter. But we attach these transmitter points on, for example, a spherical object, so it becomes a spherical transmitter in that case. We came up with such a design on purpose so that later, for example, you could change the shape of your transmitter. Still, it's usable, or you can put multiple transmission points on the same transmitter object. You define the coordinates of your transmitters and receivers, the radius, radii of the transmitters and the receivers, the radius of your carrier molecules, and finally, the diffusion coefficient. It's not written here. There's also one more thing. You can actually put as many objects as you wish in the environment. These objects could be reflective or absorbing. You can put a very large reflective or absorbing object and put everything inside that object, which actually implies a bounded environment. So bounding the environment is not another feature. It is actually implemented by using such an object. You can play with the simulation step size, simulation duration, the symbol size, and the symbol duration. Simulation is run via generating the environment file, as I mentioned, with the Lua script. You look at time versus the number of received molecules, and the user can fit his or her own modulation scheme by making use of the raw results. So you can implement any type of modulation scheme there. As I said, this is meant to be a platform. The computer we're using has this configuration. Please pay attention to that. Our CPU is a simple Intel i5 processor. On purpose, we did not go for a powerful processor. That's enough for us, because actually everything is going on the GPU. This system is a simple, actually, desktop computer, and there's a single GPU on this computer. I will mention later for our future plans about multiple GPUs. And the overall cost of the system, including the GPU card, was $1,500. We're making use of NVIDIA CUDA. We're using Torch. Actually, we're using QTorch with CUDA backend for Torch 7. One problem here is QTorch is new. The community for QTorch is not very large at the moment, and it's quite difficult to find sufficient documentation on QTorch. That's also a new system that's coming up, and we believe it will be more widely used in the future. As I said, this is ongoing work at the moment. Actually, this is being implemented by 2 undergraduate students as their senior project, but we will keep on assigning this project to new coming students to keep this alive. Anyways, even if these students graduate, they will hopefully also keep on contributing here. For the simulations, we try to verify our results by making use of, by comparing against Musin, which is actually a CPU-based simulator, again developed by Birkan Yılmaz from our group. The question would come for Accord. In our future plans, yes, we're planning to compare against Accord. Accord is a hybrid system, so we need to go into more details of how we can do the comparison with Accord. Comparison with Accord would not be straightforward, whereas the comparison with Musin is straightforward. That's why we started with that one first. By the way, Musin is also available free, so if you need, you can also make use of that. We run the simulations with 2 different transfer models with 6 different scenarios. The scenarios have different receiver radius, distance between the transmitter and the receiver, and diffusion coefficients. As I mentioned, we have a point transmitter, and the results I will show are for the case of 1 transmitter, 1 receiver. So we have a point transmitter placed on a spherical, sorry, that should be a transmitter, not a receiver. On the other side, there's also a spherical receiver. The transmission point is analytically modeled in the mentioned paper, again by us. The point transmission on a spherical receiver is implemented as I discussed earlier, and this model is compared with the analytical case without the spherical transmitter. So for the case of point transmitter, spherical receiver, there's already the analytical solution. Now, when you have the spherical transmitter and spherical receiver, then there is not the analytical solution yet. We're also working on that. Otherwise, the number of received molecules are lower than the analytical model, as I mentioned. So these are the different scenarios we considered. That's 79.40 value for the diffusion coefficient is a typical scenario for the human body. We consider different radius values and distances. Here, the lines are probably not very visible here, but there's a almost perfect fit between the analytical result and the simulations. As I mentioned, this is the case where you have a spherical receiver and the point transmitter. So everything runs perfectly here. Well, if you compare here, you see that actually we capture the behavior, but especially if you look at here, you realize that we're undershooting in the simulations. And the reason is the thing we're comparing with is the analytical results for the point transmission and the spherical receiver. And what you have in the simulations is the point transmitter is attached to the other side of the transmitter. So the receiver is here, the transmitter is here, but the transmission point is to this side of the transmitter rather than the side that faces the receiver. Therefore, some molecules have difficulty in reaching the destination as expected. How about the speed up, which is the aim of this study actually? Other than that, everything of course has been done earlier. We look at the simulation scenario. It depends on the simulation duration, step time, and the number of molecules in the environment. The diffusion coefficient, the distance between the transmitter and the receiver, and molecule size do not significantly affect the simulation time, the execution time, and the dependence on the simulation duration and step time turns out to be linear. How about the number of molecules? What's the effect of the number of molecules? That's actually the one that differs. Now, in this figure, you realize that if I have, okay, here, let me look closer. This is 3.5, and this is the value 4. So we have a step duration of 10 to the minus 5 seconds, and the symbol duration is 1 second. So we have 10 to the 5 actually operations going on. Now, in the figure, I'm just trying to read from here, as the number of molecules is increasing, after some point, you see the divergence between the CPU simulator, Musin, it's not able to keep up with the increasing number of molecules against the GPU simulator. And let me again check the value here. That's 4,500 there, 4,500 there. For the second scenario, for example, we reduce the step durations to 10 to the minus 4. So we make it large, and still 1 second. So the number of operations decreases, and you see the similar behavior actually going on. So as a summary, actually, the most important thing is for scenario 2, we have a speed up factor going up to something like 200. This is simply because we're making use of GPU, not because we're doing something very good, but the only thing is we're making use of a GPU. So it's really important to make use of such a tool. So we observe that the execution time linearly depends on the number of operations. The number of molecules in the environment exponentially increases. The execution time, if we use the CPU simulators, and as we utilize parallel processing in our simulators, this is almost linear for us for the range we're looking at. Of course, after some point, that will also start going exponential. So as a future work, one thing is, of course, we need to compare against other simulators. These results were obtained last week. We need to consider different molecule types for reception. We are developing some additional modules for absorbing and reflecting boundaries. That's still work in progress. It's not complete yet. And the system at the moment allows for multiple transmitters and receivers, but still there's some additional modules we would like to add there before they become available. The project itself is available in GitHub. If you want to access it, you can access it from there. As I mentioned, this is a senior project, so the deadline for the project submission itself is in June. So by mid-June, it would be hopefully version 1.0 there. And we have also just created a email group for anyone who wants to make use of it. So we will be at one end of it, but the important thing is if you work as a community, everyone can contribute there. So that will be the end of my presentation. I hope I'm in time. And as I mentioned earlier, you're all welcome to make use of it, and we would really appreciate any feedback and also contributed models from everyone. If somehow you need the configuration of the computer, whatever the GPU we are using, just send us an email and we will help you. Send us an email, and we will do our best to share the information we have.
Thank you, Tuna, for your very interesting presentation. Are there any questions for Tuna?
If I have understood well, you have implemented all the simulator with the GPU. Is it right?
Once again, please.
All the simulator is implemented in the GPU. Is it right?
Yes, I mean, of course, it first works on the CPU, but then the CPU sends all these movement commands to the GPU, and the molecule's movement is implemented on the GPU.
Only the movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think
And the reception process, of course.
Do you think that it is feasible to use your work as a sort of library and to offload from other simulators the most CPU demanding part to the GPU, or do you think that the input-output from the GPU would become the bottleneck?
The input-output from the GPU would not be a bottleneck, but the problem is, at the moment, as I said, this is not in version 1.0. So as of today, it cannot be used as a library. At the moment, it's working like a standalone simulation system. But yes, it is a good idea to convert it to a library, write the API for these so that they could be used from other simulators. Probably the API itself there would run on CPU again. So you would be talking to our CPU, and our CPU would be communicating with the GPU so that it can be used with different type of external simulators, let me say. One other future work I did not mention, I forgot to mention that, is actually our ultimate target is to carry this to a GPU cluster. So at the moment, this is version 1. This version is designed to work on a single GPU. We actually need to put another layer in between that can handle multiple GPUs so that you can distribute the load over multiple GPUs. So I have another project proposal for the implementation of a GPU cluster. If we get that funded and set up a GPU cluster, that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
What do you think about the computational performance of your simulator when you will implement more molecule types? I mean, have you to control if the different types of molecules will be compatible with the receiver node, right?
Yes.
Do you think that this control, this check, could be implemented by the GPU, or do you have to make this control on the CPU?
If you make it on the CPU, you will lose all the beauty of this. So it should be implemented on the GPU. When you're doing GPU programming, there's actually a very important point. Now, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So it doesn't mean that, oh, we've developed a an excellent simulator. So, you know, all of you forget about all the other simulators you use, just use, no. GPU programming requires that you're able to run your code segments in parallel, completely in parallel. If you can make use of it, GPU is best. That's why we achieve those very high speed-up factors. If you start pushing your code from the GPU towards the CPU side, then just get rid of GPU, because GPU programming is a little bit more difficult compared to the regular CPU programming we already very well know. So if you're not able to utilize the GPU, don't go for GPU programming. Just use your regular simulators. Therefore, the answer to your question is it should be done on the GPU. If it's not done on the GPU, if you put that burden, that's a more time-consuming part of it. If you put that burden on the CPU, it will not help. But it is doable. It can be done on the GPU side.
So I guess this whole GPU thing relies on the fact that you have independent movement of the particles. So could you also extend the concept to when you're interested in having reactions, for example, or
Collisions. Well, that's a good question. And difficult to, actually, the answer is not that difficult. The implementation itself is difficult. If you want to implement collisions, you have to find with which molecules you will collide, and then communicate with the corresponding cores of the GPU, or put them on the same GPU core. That's quite a lot of processing. Again, that part of processing now cannot be typically done on GPU side. You will have to carry that to CPU. So if you want to go for collisions between the molecules, this will not help very much. Well, it will not be worse than what you already do in CPU programming, but you will not gain those high speed-up factors. So it would be best if you can somehow approximate the effect of collisions and try to avoid it. Because if you need to make, if you need to consider collisions, then you should opt to something else, which is HLA-based simulations, high-level architecture. Let's say architecture that was developed initially for military simulations. We've also developed such a simulator in the past, something like 6-7 years ago with Ali Akkaya, my former PhD student. What you do there is actually you split the volume into smaller cubes, and then you have a federation of these, and then you look at the local neighbors. There you implement your implementations. Then the problem is, if you look at the borders of those cubes, it's possible that some of the neighbors fall into the other cube. Then you have to take care of that. So that is the real way to implement it. If you're really interested in what happens in the actual case, but then your simulations will significantly slow down. If you want to go for that, that's more realistic, but it's too costly, I would say. We've already done that. That's really costly.
I also have a second question, so may I ask? So you've also considered, like in the previous talk, an absorbing receiver, but here it seemed like it was not the integral of all the particles that we received in one time slot, but because it faded away again after some time. So can you comment on what was the motivation to consider this?
Because, well, the answer is simple. This was just to show that actual things are working. We made the comparisons, especially with this one. We made the comparisons with the analytical solution. So it was for an absorbing receiver. the analytical solution is for the observing receiver. So whatever is available in the literature for the analytical solution, we implemented exactly the same thing to show that we're actually doing the corrections, the correct simulation. Of course, we can consider different types of receivers. Then probably you will not be able to compare with the analytical solution. Then you will have to compare with some other simulations. That's, as I mentioned, it's in our future plans to compare with other types of simulations, but you have to do it again with simulations, not with the analytical solution. Also, just a side information about the receivers. In one of our previous works, we have shown that you do not have to cover the whole surface of the receiver with receptors. If you put, I'm not sure about the exact percentage. If I'm not wrong, it was around 40% of the surface with receptors. It acts like a receiver completely covered with receptors. It has the same effect.
Okay. Other questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. For the next talk, we have Valeria Oscri from the University of Europe Institute.
Okay. Thanks to everybody to be here and good afternoon to everyone. I'm Valeria Luscri from INRIA Lille Nord Europe. I work in the FUN team. FUN stands for Self-Organizing Future Ubiquitous Networks. And I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about app conversion phenomenon as an enabler for nanoscale communication channel modeling, a jointly work I'm doing with Anna Maria Vegni of Roma Tre University. So I will try to spend some few words in order to understand in which consists the app conversion phenomenon. And I will explain why we are convinced that it can be considered a very useful tool to modeling nanocommunication channel. And I will present you the direction that we are currently following in order to do that, to create a kind of nanocommunication channel between two nodes by exploiting this process. So, first of all, I think it's useful in order to understand in which consists app conversion phenomenon. It's useful to talk a little bit about the opposite phenomenon, namely the down conversion process, because we are more used to assist to observe it. Imagine to have a scheme with two components, a donor and an acceptor, or a transmitter and a receiver in the communication, in a communication scheme. The down conversion consists in exciting with the power source, for example, with a laser characterized with a certain frequency and a certain energy, the donor node that will react by emitting a signal, and we can assist to an energy transfer. Energy transfer towards the acceptor node that will re-emit a signal with a frequency and an energy that are lower than the input one. So app conversion is exactly the opposite phenomenon. So we are able to excite a donor with a near infrared. Here you can observe more or less how it works. That you can excite with a power source with a near infrared radiation the donor, and you assist to an energy transfer towards the receiver. And the receiver re-emits a signal in correspondence to the visible light spectrum. So the frequency is shifted and the energy is higher. So this is pretty interesting for several reasons that I will tell you. Just to give you a visual representation of the up conversion mechanism, you can observe that at the right side there is an energy transfer that is occurring, but there is a mismatch in terms of energy. And maybe is better explained in this figure, where at the left side you can observe a non-radiative resonant transfer that is specifically related to, for example, a FRET phenomenon, first resonant energy transfer, where the sender and the receiver in this case are characterized with similar spectral characteristics, with similar spectral features. At the right side, you can observe the PAET phenomenon, namely the phonon-assisted energy transfer, where there is an epsilon energy gap that has to be filled in some way in order the energy transfer mechanism to occur. And it is thanks to phonons, so the vibrational components of an host matrix that play a fundamental role in our communication scheme, that this process can happen. So, in the second case, in the right side, even if the two components, donor and acceptor, are not characterized with similar spectral characteristics, it is possible to assist to an energy transfer phenomenon. And so what is important to outline here is that recently, above all in the medical research community for diagnostic purpose, people started to analyze this kind of phenomenon in terms of diagnostic, because they make reference to specific particles that are rare earth particles, such, for example, terbium, erbium, or things like that that you were able to observe in the video. And they are really interesting particles because they present nice features. Interesting also from a communication point of view. In fact, specific components such as, for example, apatite doped particles can present a really anti-stock shift. So this means that by playing with the dopant concentration of the host matrix, it's possible to irradiate with a near-infrared radiation and to obtain a shift that in terms of frequency ranging from green, yellow to narrowband red. That is a portion of the spectrum that is particularly interesting because it's possible to obtain a more pure signal. And another important characteristic is, for example, non-autofluorescence. This means that we are able to obtain something that is more clean in terms of signal. Low photo bleaching yesterday was just mentioned as a characteristic that can be positive or negative. In our case, in terms of communication, we believe that it is important in order to make the system more resilient, more robust. And by considering molecular communication as a viable tool for in vivo application, it is important to have components that are characterized with low biotoxicity in the tissue. And since this particle, this rare earth, have been already considered as bio-image components for diagnostic purpose, this feature has been already analyzed, and it has been established that the level of toxicity is really lower than quantum dots, for example. What is more interesting from a communication point of view is that we are injecting something that here is near infrared, so is not damaging the tissue. But we obtain something that is in the visible light spectrum, and this means that we are able to achieve further distance with an improved detection sensitivity and a high signal-to-noise ratio. So these features were convincing us that about the goodness of up conversion as a viable way to model a nanocommunication channel. In order to realize this communication scheme, we considered a one-to-one, for the moment, a one-to-one communication scheme with a donor and an acceptor, with a transmitter and a receiver. We made reference to specific rare earth components, neodymium and ytterbium, on a new series of glasses. What is interesting to outline in this case is that the same components can behave in a totally different way based on the different host metrics. For example, in the case of a ferroelectric laser crystal, these components are able to realize an energy transfer that is dictated through a resonant process. In the case we considered, since we were interested to analyze the role of the phonons in this context, the process we considered is non-resonant. And we made reference to experimental results that have been presented in literature. And it has been observed that the energy transfer efficiency can achieve results around 95%. So the main idea, the simple idea to start to approach to this phenomenon in order to model a communication channel is to consider, as I was saying, a one-to-one communication scheme in a similar way done already by Akan and Cuscu, concerning the FRET process. And so if at the beginning of a time slot we have the donor excited with the laser, this means that we want to transmit bit 1. Otherwise, we want to transmit a bit 0. And then we associated an on-off key modulation scheme and derived the capacity from a theoretical point of view. This is the zeta channel that we associated where even if we consider that the channel is for the moment ideal, we have the possibility that we excite with the laser a donor, but the process of energy transfer is not occurring. We associated to the transmission of the bit 0 a probability equal to 1, but not considering other type of noise in the channel for the moment, for the sake of simplicity. So, as I was mentioning, we adopted a similar approach as considered in the case of the first process, but the main difference is that here, if we consider the same components, the same rare air particles, and we change the host matrix and we change the concentration of the dopant, we can obtain results that are different both in terms of energy transfer, but above all in terms of capacity. And this suggests us that if with the new technological advancement, we will be able to control the generation of the phonons with the respective frequency and energy, this means that we will gain an high control on our communication system. The importance to evaluate the dopant concentration lies on the fact that with the same components, we can obtain different type of color and then associate more complicated modulation scheme, such as, for example, color-based modulation approach. Just for completeness, I show you the emission and absorption spectra of neodymium and ytterbium that we have considered. And what is important to observe in this figure is the poor overlapping region about the two spectra. And this low overlapping is compensated thanks to the phonons. In fact, in the insets, you can observe the difference, the gap in terms of energy that has to be filled by the phonons. So in this work, the scientists were able to demonstrate that are the phonons that play this fundamental role in order to make the process, the energy transfer process to occur. I didn't present the results because, to be honest, this is a work in progress, and we are just finalizing it to submit for revision the results. So, for the sake of time and for that reason, I preferred to not present the results in terms of capacity. Thanks for your attention. I'm really happy to answer to your question if you have any.
Very nice presentation. Quick question. At the end, with this up conversion process, you still need an initial source of energy, right? So you mentioned you may need a light source, for example. Would those be nano?
it could be inside, because you know this has been used in any case for make bioimaging, for derived bioimaging. So it could be an external power source for sure, not inside the laser inside. At least for the moment, I don't imagine this possibility.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Valeria.
Thank you.
We have Roxanne Zurich from the Newcastle University.
So we are already over, we are in break time, but I'll try to make it shorter. So I'm the last one between you and your break. Oops. Sorry. No, okay. Right. I'll talk about reproducibility of biological system designs, and I'll particularly focus upon a data standard called the Synthetic Biology Open Language. It is developed by a community. But the reproducibility of design is a huge issue at the moment, and is partly due to incomplete design information, or not just capturing the design correctly. And clearly, as the size and complexity of designs increases, it becomes more important to standardize the representation of these designs. So there are many tools being developed, and often the output from one of these tools is not incompatible for processing by other tools. So therefore, it is very important that we have data standards to facilitate communications between different tooling. So what kind of designs we can have? So a design can have many forms. One of them is obviously visual form, as in paper. So by looking at this figure, I can understand it's about engineering a metabolic pathway, but it's for human understanding. It might be missing some intermediate steps. Another form is, of course, textual descriptions from papers, for example. We read the text manually and try to extract information. However, the biological behavior is often through interactions of biological components. Therefore, we initially need the nucleotide sequences perhaps to encode components and therefore the function, right? So those sequences are reported again in many different ways, sometimes using identifiers from biological databases, and then we are left the task of fetching the data. And sometimes you have forward and reverse primers, then users are left the task of completing the puzzle. And often coding sequences are reported. That's great, useful for getting the sequences to encode proteins, but we also need the sequences for regulatory elements such as promoters, ribosome binding sites, terminators, which are essential to amplify the system's output. And then you need the order of these components, where they are laid out, whether you use a chromosomal integration or you use plasmid deployment and so on. Again, molecular interactions should also be captured in a standard manner. And data relevant to the design of biological systems is not just limited here. For example, data includes predictive models or biological contexts such as which chassis or host organism you use, or experimental conditions such as pH and temperature are also very, very important because they affect the system. So the system is not just about the cell. So if there are any ethical or regulatory issues that may have an effect on the designs, again, these should be captured too. So the Synthetic Biology Open Language, or SBOL, has been developed particularly to address these issues, and in summary, it facilitates data exchange between researchers, companies, fabrication centers, and so on. So it enables forward engineering in synthetic biology. It allows storing designs in databases. It allows developing tools on top of this data standard, for example, modeling tools, design automation tools. We can start with an abstract design. Those abstract designs can then compile into several solutions. Both of them can be represented using SBOL. Or we can represent very complex systems using modular subsystems which promote modularity. Or SBOL is useful to standardize representations of designs in publications to promote reproducibility. So it has two main functions. To summarize, the blue-colored ones representing some entities for primary structural level information, and on the right-hand side, some red entities for functional layer. The important one here is, so component definition entity is useful for presenting not just DNA-based entities, but also proteins, small molecules. And the module definition here is useful for representing devices, systems, and so on. So is the little bit more detailed data module. I won't go into the detail, but perhaps it's worth of saying that ESPO has a way of top-level entities which are worthy of exchange. In this case, there are 4 of them. Component definitions for biological components, module definitions for device or systems, model to point, it's like a placeholder to point to where the actual models, which can be encoded in other existing standards, and they can be grouped in collections. So what's the difference between other formats and ESPO? So starting from FASTA format, you can have an array of nucleotides or amino acids in GenBank. You can then talk about certain positions to say the functionality of that area. And in ESPO, we introduced hierarchy, so you can represent whole system as a device. Then you can say, okay, it's composed of 2 different entities. The first one is composed of 5 DNA regions, and the second one, and so on. In ESPO 2, we introduced even more interesting data, such as molecular interactions. In ESPO, we can also talk about the relative positions using sequence constraints. For example, in this case, the example precedes constraint allows me to specify constraints between any 2 entities. Therefore, I can drive the order. So these are, although it looks simple, I can easily start specifying abstract designs. Or I can talk about exact positions, cut sites. Equally, custom application-specific information can be embedded, and this is very important, such as who designed this part or device or system. If there's any measurement data, it can be attached to designs easily using ESPO. I'll talk about a very general biological example, in this case, a sender-receiver system. Usually in the bacteria, in the wild type version, Satellin is a signal molecule, is an antibiotic. Basically, it is used to kill other bacteria. And that it also coordinates the behavior at the population level. In the engineered version, Satellin is exported by the sender cells and imported by the receiver cells, and then reported by producing GFP, or green fluorescent protein, which can then be measured or quantified in the lab. So using ESPO, we can represent this system. To give an example, for the receiver module, which is composed of 2 submodules, the signaling receiver and the reporter. So here, starting with the DNA entities, all coming from the bottom up. So it's a promoter, 2 coding sequence, encoding a kinase and response regulator. Satellin phosphorylates the kinase, or I call it activation. Once phosphorylated, this phosphorylate is then passed to a response regulator. So this SPAR, the response regulator, once it's phosphorylated, it becomes active and therefore can bind to this promoter to activate the expression of GFP, green fluorescent proteins. So using ESPO, I can then create 2 submodules. So this box is a 1 module, another one. I can then even say that the input for this reporter module should be the one output from the receiver submodule. If there are variants of SPAR, well, we can do like hundreds or thousands maybe, by doing mutations or creating orthogonal paths. I can then map to the correct one. And this whole system itself is a module. Therefore, I can define inputs and outputs for the complex system as well, and say Saturn is the input and GFP is the output. Well, as I said, ESPO is not about modeling. We don't capture dynamic modeling information. Instead, we have the model entity, which points to where the actual models are. Your models can be, for example, in the systems biology markup language for discrete simulations, or in Kappa format for rule-based model simulations, or in molecular files even. So very simple, very, very simple example, just to represent a single component, in this case a promoter, using ESPO. We use the component definition entity. It has a bunch of properties. It has a URI rather than ID. That allows us to globally identify a component, which can then be stored in databases, and using semantic web technologies, we can do mappings. In this case, it's qualified by parse registry. It's a biobrick, so it's a name, description, and we use ontologies to standardize the meaning of different terms. In this case, its type is given by DNA region term from the established BioPax ontology, and the role of this DNA region is again given using another ontology, in this case, sequence ontology, and the term is promoter. So that makes the whole data machine accessible when you change the data. And to the sequence nucleotides, in this case, its encoding is given by the BioPax encoding type. And when it's serialized, that's the XML, the horrible version. I won't go into the detail, but it is serialized using RDF XML. RDF, Resource Description Framework, is a special format. It is used in general to represent any graph. And because it's in RDF, I can then start embedding any custom data, and it still becomes Espo file. So there are already many tools being developed, and these tools range from visualization platforms to modeling tools or genetic design automation tools. And the good thing is, so you have Espo as the carrier of data. Now you can create complex workflows to achieve tasks that cannot be done by using any of these tools, right? So recently, ACS Synthetic Biology adopted Espo, which is really, really great. Hopefully, we'll have more data coming from the publications. So Espo, well, developing standards is very, very difficult, I have to say this, right? The effort for Espo started in around 2008 from Michael Gazicki's PhD thesis. I joined the committee in 2010. And since then, we have more than 100 members from more than 50 different institutions, including universities, research centers, companies, and so on. And it's part of Combine. Combine is the Computational Modeling in Biology Network. And every year we have 2 meetings. The first one is called Combine meeting, where we have the related research plus breakouts where we talk about issues in general. And the second one is called Harmony, and it's complete about hacking the standard, writing libraries, going through the website, talking about issues, and arguing, basically. Well, the community, the development of Espo is governed by an elected chair. At the moment it is Professor Neil Weipert from Newcastle University, and elected 5 editors, and I also served as an editor previously. And the Espo developers list is open to everyone. You can join the list and participate in the discussions. And we are developing different APIs which are available in different programming languages, including Java, JavaScript, and so on. They are all open source, and you can reuse them. So in summary, Espo is great for unambiguous exchange of genetic circuit designs for machine access, facilitates the use of information. Its data model is very extendable, particularly to store metadata or application-specific information, and integrates well with existing semantic web technologies to store, retrieve, and query data. These tools already exist and all come free with the Espo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Are there any questions, Dr.? No one?
Right. Everyone wants coffee, I guess. Sorry.
Okay. We are a little late, so maybe we can talk with Dr. also in the coffee break. So thank you again to
right.
all of the presenters. The next panel will start in time. Edward, what do you think of that? So we have 10 times for the coffee break. 10 minutes, sorry.